So check this out. I pick out this game at GameStop, a Wii U game called Rodea the Sky Soldier. I open it up and there's two discs inside it, one for the Wii and one for the Wii U, with two instruction booklets to match. I was super confused. Come to find out, Rodea the Sky Soldier has one of the more bizarre development histories that I've ever heard of. Rodea was the first major game developed by Probe, a team led by devs who escaped from Sonic Team. The game was developed for the Wii and completed in 2011, but the publisher they found, Kadokawa, wanted to release it on the Wii and the 3DS simultaneously. Kadokawa took the finished Wii game and gave it to a completely unrelated dev team to make the 3DS version. This second team not only vastly altered the game by changing fundamental gameplay mechanics, but it took them 3 years to finish the 3DS port. By the time the 3DS version was finally ready to release, the Wii had effectively been retired, and Kadokawa decided not to release the original Wii game. Still hell-bent on a dual release, Kadokawa had the screw-up team spend another year porting the shoddy 3DS version to the Wii U, all while Probe sat around wondering what the hell happened to their game. In 2015, Rodea the Sky Soldier was finally released as the bastardized ports limped onto the 3DS and the Wii U. Probe's original, untarnished Wii version was never officially released. It was relegated to a completely unadvertised bonus disc packaged in certain copies of the Wii U game. Although the Wii disc is pretty cheap on eBay at time of recording, so at least a lot of Wii copies made it into circulation. I'm going to play the Wii version first because I just did Space Camp. Cut me a freaking break. You play as Rodea, who looks, sounds, and acts like the protagonist from a Yu-Gi-Oh! Sequel. Rodea is a robot who fights to protect the airborne kingdom of Garuda from the evil land-based empire of Naga. The game opens with Rodea fighting a bunch of other robots and trying to save Princess Cecilia. They get cornered by bad guys, so the princess gives Rodea half a magic key, and somehow it's never used or mentioned again, teleports him to a desert while she sacrifices herself. This pisses off Rodea so much that he punches the ground as hard as he can, disintegrating his entire arm and knocking himself unconscious for a full 1,000 years. Damn, I knew anime protagonists had a tendency to angst and brood, but raging so hard you knock yourself out for a full millennia has to be a world record. Anyway, Rodea is salvaged and rebuilt 1,000 years later by an engineer girl named Ion, coincidentally at the exact same time the Empire reinvades. Garuda apparently has absolutely no standing army, navy, or weapons of any kind, despite living directly above a nation inhabited by immortal war machines, so it falls to Rodea and Ion to stop the invasion. The game could best be described as a platforming game where all movement is done with Spider-Man's web zip. You point the cursor where you want to go, press B, and Rodea takes off flying to the spot you pointed to. He moves slowly enough that you can easily change direction and fly somewhere else in mid-flight, and you can hold A to boost to your destination, attacking enemies, and bouncing off surfaces when you hit them. Each level, you're thrown into a set of wide-open spaces and floating platforms, and you make your way to the end by tagging nearby surfaces to fly from place to place. You can also cling to walls, and by shaking the Wii remote, you can arc around to your target to get around obstacles or to get a better view of your true destination. Funny thing is, the game doesn't fully explain the flight controls, and I had Rodea constantly trying to fly up through the bottoms of platforms because I thought you had to shake the remote every time you flew, period. But by default, the game's pathfinding works near perfectly and doesn't idly send you crashing into shit. The gameplay is exhilarating. There are almost no limits to your flying ability other than not being able to tag objects that are really far away. You're given so much freedom with the flight that it's fully possible to complete entire levels without touching the ground. Much like the innate thrill of running fast in classic Sonic games, the speed of the action, the freedom you're given, and the controls so streamlined you can traverse levels with little more than a thought combine to form a wicked good time. With a little practice, you can absolutely blaze through stages, and your brain kind of starts to subconsciously treat it as an extreme sport. You want to push how far you can go at once. You want to keep the action flowing. The game has 25 levels, and they get a wide variety of stages thrown in, so you get the most possible use out of the unique mechanics. You've got small islands spaced apart where you have to cross by carefully looking for footholds to proceed, linear stages where you just blast through the level like crazy, wide open stages where you can freely roam with a ton of terrain to fly across, wide open enemy bases where enemies are everywhere and you search around while blowing through enemies, and a few volcano levels where several floors and walls damage you and you have to slow down and put a little more careful thought into things. The game does have enemies, but much like the good Sonic games, they're often used more as obstacles than actual foes that you have to fight. Most of them go down in 2 hits or a few seconds, so the flow of the game isn't disrupted and the emphasis stays on the unique platforming. Most of the enemies fire missiles that you dodge by flying, so they serve more to force you to never stop moving than to pose any real threat. Hell, most of the time the game has actual combat, you're given a machine gun that lets you just mow the enemies down and move on anyway. The bosses are neat, but a tad too easy. At the end of every chapter, you fight a giant robot by hitting it in the face to make weak points appear. It's kinda neat to climb all over them, but it's just a little too simple. You also regularly fight Rodea's evil evil siblings, and apart from a really cool mid-air battle around Ion's airship, you kinda just point at them and they die. At least one I killed before they got all their dialogue out. The game borrows a few comfortable elements from the Sonic games. You collect gravitons, which give you extra lives whenever you collect 100, and are used to open bonus areas with little side-scrolling puzzle rooms. You've got Sonic's item boxes, boost pads, the shield items, the visuals ape Sonic Team signature aesthetic, and an arcade-style damage mechanic. Getting hit blows up your tail, but there are items to grow back the tail or power it up to increase your strength and turn your hair green. There's also a lock-on item that's blatantly a scouter. Also, like Sonic, the game pointlessly grades you on completion time and gravitons collected, which more often than not only serves to yell "you suck" at the end of every level. Although I do like the idea that the game has optional side challenges for item hunting and speedrunning. Pretty sure there's no reward for either beyond a nice grade from teacher, but it's still a fun idea. So former Sonic team members, non-Sonic team members, and a random guy who develops games as a hobby can all make good Sonic games, but Sonic Team can't crack the code to save their lives despite over a decade of chances and practice. I have a few complaints with the gameplay, but none are deal breakers. The camera moves a little slowly and there are no sensitivity options. When your tail gets blown up from taking damage, you get gimped to where you can barely fly and can't attack enemies. You're basically helpless until you drag yourself to one of the abundant wing power-ups, and it just grinds the game to a halt for no real reason. Lots of levels have strong gusts of wind that try to blow you off course, but if you're on the ground, the wind stuns you unless you hold B for several seconds. You're just immobilized even if you do this little minigame correctly for several seconds, and if you're anywhere near an enemy, you're guaranteed to take a hit. Also, this game really should have used the nunchuck in its control scheme, or at least made it an option, because B is used for 3 or 4 different commands, but when you try and do them, it just sends you flying. A nunchuck would have given us a control stick instead of walking with the stiff-ass D-pad, and it would have added more buttons so they wouldn't have had to map everything to B. The only other major weakness the Wii game has is that it doesn't have much of a plot until the last 5 levels. Ion and Rodea travel to 4 Kronos towers, kill the bosses, and that's it. That somehow stops Naga's invasion. There's next to no world building, and we really don't know jack about the main villains until a few info dumps late in the game. Most of the plot is just Rodea trying to remember his past, the past that we already know because we saw it play out in the prologue. Things pick up briefly in Chapter 3 when Ion gets kidnapped, and you get some other villagers briefly traveling with you, like this girl, Sonia. Sonia's voice acting is so bizarre, it was driving me crazy trying to figure out if she's supposed to be stoned or if she really wanted to, check Rodea's oil, tug out his dipstick, pump his gasoline, give him the sex. I'm going to play a few clips for you and make your own guess if she's meant to be baked or horned up.
Oh, you helped my brother, Mr. Rodea. You are such a kind person. I owe at least that much to Mr. Rodea. It's so cramped. I hope Mount Evan has enough room for all of us.
It's hard to tell, right? By the way, the answer is either stoned or really, really stupid.
Do you happen to know where Ion lives?
Oh, you're quite the little talker.
The relationship that forms between Rodea and Ion is pretty sweet and thankfully not romantic, at least in the dubbed version. Rodea has no problem letting Ion know how annoying she is. Ion is completely oblivious to Rodea's super serious anime hero persona, and they kind of troll each other into becoming better people, and they form a sweet friendship. It's some nice development, there's just no plot to go alongside it, you know? Once you blow up the Kronos towers, you run into Rodea's 4th evil sibling, Chaz from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX! Basically, Garuda only crosses over Naga once every 1,000 years, and the magic key from the start of the game can freeze Garuda in place for an invasion. Then there's a whole lot of time travel technobabble that I don't understand, and Rodea and Ion travel 1,000 years in the past to fight Naga's leader, Machine Emperor Gyardo. I prefer Machine Emperor Weissel, but that's just me. Last Yu-Gi-Oh! Reference, I swear. You have this epic level plowing through a ton of enemies charging Gyardo's fortress set to kick-ass music. It gets your pulse pounding, it gets you psyched for the final showdown, and then to pad out the chapter you have to go through 2 filler levels where you cross through 2 alternate dimensions to get 2 elevators to work. Way to kill the mood, bruh. Who the hell builds their base like this? Also, F these spiky robots, F every person who programmed these robots, and F everybody who delivered pizza to the dev team while they were making these robots. You can only damage them the few seconds when their shells are open, they close mid-attack with nowhere for you to lock onto to abort your flight, and 90% of the time I hit them while they're open, and it doesn't count. F! After a startlingly dark plot twist where Gyardo invaded Garuda because Naga is a wasteland and its people are nearly extinct, you kill Gyardo and Chaz, and Gyardo takes on a skyscraper-sized second form. This final boss sucks. You have to attack several tentacles spread out across this big abyss with almost nothing to fly to. There are just towers that gradually get electrified when you lock onto them, platforms on the ground that the boss starts covering in huge damaging waves, and tentacles that move your lock-on cursor into the damaging floor so that you die. The objects of the level are spread out ridiculously far, and you just keep flying into massive dead zones where there's nothing to fly to except a surface that kills you. Like the whole stage is just one big trap, and you're so weak with a busted tail that screwing up once means you're pretty much dead. You don't get a chance to recover. Then you have to fly to Gyardo's core with nothing to fly through except rocks that kill you with giant death beams that seem to fire at random. And this fight has no checkpoints. It took over an hour and 20 lives of trial and error, but I finally figured out there's kind of a path between the tentacles to avoid dead zone traps that just takes forever you to find on your own. I honed the technique for flying off tentacles without them killing you, and I figure out there are 4 guns on the robot's chest to tell you where to dodge the lasers. And I finally kill the damn Emperor. Rodea has to stay behind while Ion escapes back to the future, but she finds him again in the future and they reunite. It's all very touching, and then the game crashes so hard you have to hard reset your system. This was not a freak occurrence. It happens every time you beat the final level. Though research indicates that the final screen in the Japanese version is just a medal tally with the severely underage Ion in a bikini, so no great loss there. You know, between the collectibles not really doing anything, the wildly annoying out-of-place wind mechanics, the final boss's difficulty curve resembling Mount Everest, and the game crashing when you beat it, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say the game wasn't fully tested between being completed, being shelved, and being put out. I never ran into any major bugs, and the game plays perfectly fine, but it still feels like the game wasn't entirely finished. But the game wasn't ever officially released, really, so I'll cut it some slack. But now, let's see how the official Wii U version stacks up. Right off the bat, I can say the Wii U graphics look much better with multiple shading effects added to the baseline models. The voice acting has way less white noise, moving and looking around with the control sticks is pretty smooth, and the game adds a nice wall of text explaining the backstory so you're not in the dark until the 80% point of the game. But the game dives off a cliff almost immediately. The controls are absolute garbage. You press A to jump, then press A again to bring up the flight cursor, then you use the control sticks to aim the cursor where you want to fly, then you press A and you finally take off flying. It takes freaking forever to line up every single flight, and it's ridiculously awkward to control. But that's not the worst of it. Unlike the Wii game, you have a limited amount of flight power, and you can only travel a short distance before you just fall out of the sky. You have to land to recharge after pretty much every single flight, and it's very easy to send yourself falling down a bottomless pit with no way to recover because you realize too late that you don't have enough power to complete a flight. So not only did they completely butcher the central mechanic of the game for no freaking reason, but they made it control like absolute ass. The game's controls are completely broken. Camera movement is somehow even more stiff than it was in the Wii version. It takes forever and a half to turn and look in another direction, and for some dumb reason, if you move the camera up or down, the game snaps it back to a horizontal orientation the literal second that you let go of the control stick. Given that you're almost never traversing level terrain, you end up constantly fighting the camera to point where you want it to go. You still have the ability to loop around to your target, but now it's done by holding the control stick in a direction while you fly. The same control stick that you use to aim the flight cursor. You will constantly fly off course and face plant into walls or enemies because the stick that you use to aim a flight path completely screws with said flight path. When you land from a jump, it takes a few seconds for the flight cursor to disappear, so you press A expecting to jump and ready another flight, only to Rodea to go rocketing off somewhere random. This got me killed a lot because the camera controls are so stiff that if you fall, good freaking luck pointing to some terrain that will save you in time. If you set up a flight and don't select a target within 2 seconds, the game just sends you flying off anyway, and the fly fast button is also used for a shitty ground attack, so if you dash into the ground, the game often has you do a second dash right off the platform. The controls are just full of "what are you doing, I didn't tell you to go there" moments, and there's barely a single moment of game time that you aren't desperately fighting the controls to go where you want. The controls make it a maddening chore to get anywhere. Most of the game's other issues stem from the addition of a completely pointless upgrade system. In the Wii U version, killing enemies gets you parts that you can use to upgrade Rodea's fight speed, damage output, and health bar. In order to shoehorn in this upgrade system, Rodea is several times weaker than he is in the base game. He flies super slowly, takes several hits to kill enemies, and you start only able to take 1 or 2 hits before dying. What's worse is, much like Life of Black Tiger, you get maybe 1 upgrade after each level, and the upgrades barely seem to do anything to make you stronger. I spent 3 upgrades to increase my health bar, and that let me take 1 extra hit before dying, so you have to grind a metric shitload of upgrades to make Rodea not useless. The reason this is a major problem is the levels and enemies are virtually unchanged from the base game, so you have a piddly-ass weak Rodea facing levels and enemies that are balanced with the assumption that you're at maximum strength. Airborne enemies will constantly fly away from you because you're too slow to catch them, often sending you falling down a bottomless pit with no flight power. Most enemies are only vulnerable to short windows of time to attack, and you're so slow you'll be lucky to land a hit before they're invincible again. These spiky worm things in level 9 I can barely reach to land a hit before they kill me, and it takes 7 or 8 hits to kill them. Oh, and the machine gun that lets you clear out enemies with ease in the original game, it's virtually useless. It deals like no damage, takes a full magazine to kill the absolute weakest enemy, and takes several seconds to reload. Why? So they could put in a set of upgrades to grind to upgrade it. This turns combat from being a brief obstacle and diversion in the base game to being a maddening mess full of enemies way outside your weight class in the full version. It's blatantly obvious this upgrade system is only in the game to forcibly pad it out, to force you to spend several hours replaying levels to slowly grind upgrades so that you can proceed. But making the game longer doesn't make the game better, not when it's only long because of endless hours of infuriating pointless busy work that makes the game boring as fuck! Another side effect of the upgrade system is because the enemies drop items instead of gravitons, there are way fewer gravitons in levels, and it's way harder to get extra lives. It seems like you can maybe get 1 extra life per stage, and you have to hunt for it. Even worse, despite having a health bar, it's much easier to die. You're constantly taking cheap damage from enemies because it's so hard to get your ass moving, and the game constantly glitches to where you take damage when you attack enemies. Son of a bitch, I should have bounced right off that guy. How is the finished product so much glitchier than the prototype? The game at one point even crashed after a cutscene, forcing me to replay an entire 20-minute stage. The Wii version never crashed like this. In the Wii version, I barely ever died and made it to the final boss with over 50 lives. Here I'm struggling to get by and dying at least once per stage, either falling to my death from the controls in limited flight or because the combat is broken bullshit! The flight mechanics are downright stressful because one wrong jump sends you falling to your death, and you have to constantly land after every single jump to make sure you have enough power for your next maneuver. The fun mechanic that defined the original game is gone. Maybe I'm too hung up on comparing this to the Wii version, but the Wii U game is still awful without the comparison. Between slow movement speed, slow tedious combat, and having to play super conservatively, the Wii U game is an abysmally slow-paced platformer. You just feel like you're tediously trudging from place to place, and the levels just seem to take forever to complete. At its best, the Wii U game is a plodding chore with shit controls built around a mechanic that doesn't work right. At its worst, it's a broken grind fest. Maybe the game gets better when you've spent several hours grinding to make Rodea worth shit as a character, but why should I work for hours to make a game quasi-tolerable when there are so many games that are good from the get-go? The full release has a few improvements. The stupid glue-yourself-to-the-ground wind mechanic is gone, and there's a button that lets you fly straight up or straight down to abort flights on command, but I think the Wii version would have added those mechanics if it had been properly tested and actually released instead of this dookie! Once you get out of the prologue, there's a ugly and out-of-place thick film grain over the graphics. The game does nothing with the gamepad, only showing a static picture of Ion. You can get the display to show the actual game, but you can only change it between levels, and doing so mutes the TV. But the most pointless change from the Wii version is that Ion talks constantly during levels. And I mean, she makes the cast of Sonic Boom look like Vow of Silence monks.
Collecting those! So fast! Collecting those! Vroom, vroom, vroom! That's a big hog! That's a big hog! Go, Rodea! So fast!
There's an option called Ion Chattiness in the options menu because referencing Bubsy makes every game better, and on setting 4 out of 5, she pipes up every few seconds. Every time you fly, and every time you spend a few seconds not flying. It's insufferable. I quit at level 9 of the Wii U version. Part of it was burnout from having just played through an infinitely better version of the game. Part of it was No Man's Sky came in at the library and I don't know how long I'll get to keep it. But mostly I just rage quit at how much you're expected to waste your time replaying boring levels to grind up to where you can make some more progress. The only thing I'm missing is the fresh, unplayable hell each boss fight would bring, and I can sleep soundly at night missing out on that. The game's first boss is a complete train wreck. You have to attack the blue light on his face, then hit a few weak points elsewhere on his body. I keep getting hit when I'm nowhere near his attacks. The game is bugged to damage you if you touch his body, so you attack the weak point in his hip, for example, only to bounce into his arm and take a hit. The auto lock-on feature keeps failing. The controls kept locking up to where I couldn't turn the camera at all. The camera is stiff, but your aiming cursor is so sensitive it's hard to draw a bead on the boss's weak points, and I had to rig the boss's AI to have him stand still for minutes at a time just to give you a chance to kill him. It's a slow, tedious, plodding affair where you have to slowly look for and target each weak point while very tediously finding a place to recharge your flight power. The boss isn't hard. I'm fighting the controls way more than I'm fighting the damn boss. And this is the first boss of the game. I don't want to think about the final boss that I could barely handle with the correct mechanics. I'm done. I'm sorry. This shit is not worth it. Probe should have sued Kadokawa for criminal destruction of property. It's unbelievable how bad the released version of Rodea the Sky Soldier is. They completely torpedoed the game's balancing to shoehorn in pointless upgrades in the name of stretching the game out longer, rendered portions of the game nigh unplayable, mutilated the game's core mechanics and sucked most of the fun out of it, gave the game a god-awful, barely responsive control scheme, added a shitload of bugs, and they made the game a trudging bore to play. It's just tragic seeing a brilliant original game go virtually unreleased while a publisher that couldn't tell its ass from a hole in the ground twists and mutilates it into absolute garbage, and I can't imagine how devastated Probe must have been to see their creation brought down to such a pathetic state. The Wii version of Rodea the Sky Soldier is a great game. It's absolutely worth a play if you can find the bonus disc, but the versions of the game that were actually released? Utter garbage. Never play them, never speak of them.
Looks like this is it.